What's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Plenty to get to today. We're going to spend this first segment talking about the U.S. men's national team. Two bad, shaky, unsatisfactory, you can throw plenty of negative adjectives out there, performances in these final two friendlies before the World Cup. And then we're going to take a look at how things have been going in Major League Soccer. It's been a little while since I've done this, and just kind of set the stage for these final 2 or 3 games for all of these teams. Look at the biggest storylines heading into these last couple weeks of the season. But first, we're talking U.S. men's national team, and I've broken this down into 3 different sections. We're going to talk takeaways, then the positional battles and kind of where people stand in terms of getting on the plane to Qatar, and then the biggest concerns about this team heading into the World Cup after what we saw in the loss to Japan and the draw with Saudi Arabia. So starting with the takeaways, and I'm going to focus on 3 here. The first one is a fairly obvious one, and it's primarily based off of the Japan game, but this team, in particular the center backs, simply have to handle pressure better. You cannot go into a World Cup with teams knowing you are that vulnerable to kind of that secondary pressure, if you will. And I talked about this on Monday, right? Japan wasn't putting the pressure on the center backs. Japan was pressuring the pass that was coming from the center backs. And so you had midfielders turning the ball over. You had center backs making bad passes. Nobody was dealing with the pressure well. And it's a very different kind of pressure than a team in CONCACAF that's trying to counterattack you and is happy to give you the ball. Japan, it was all about setting traps to get into advantageous positions to make players uncomfortable. And the U.S. just didn't deal with it well at all. We talked about all of the turnovers coming out of that game. And I will say one more time here, the concerns about the Walker Zimmerman Aaron Long pairing have nothing to do with the fact these guys are in Major League Soccer and that they haven't seen the likes of a Harry Kane. The concern is what happens with the ball at their feet, and particularly, can they deal with this kind of pressure? And I'm still not 100% sure the U.S. is going to see it in the group stage just because of the way those teams play. Maybe somebody looks at this and says we need to be more aggressive and play higher up the field because of the vulnerabilities the U.S. has displayed. But the U.S., regardless of how things go in the group, the U.S. is not going to get where they want to go in this tournament and live up to kind of these expectations the fan base has put on this team without solving this problem. Simply have to be more composed, make better decisions, and punish teams for pressing you that way. You cannot be that sloppy. It is also worth noting, for all of the criticism the center backs have received, most of it valid, Walker Zimmerman had some really nice passes against Saudi Arabia when given time on the ball. When there was no pressure, he did have a couple passes that unlocked the defense to a certain extent. One of them was to Weston McKennie over the top. There were also some not so great moments. There's the one pass from Aaron Long that, I mean, it kind of went viral and it was awful. There's no 2 ways about it. But Zimmerman in particular showed he has the ability to make those passes when there's no pressure. The question is, what happens if a team doesn't give you time on the ball or is immediately going to go after and every single player you're trying to pass to and trying to take those passes away the way Japan did? That's the question. We're not going to have an answer until we get to Qatar. The third thing I want to talk about here with the press that can easily get lost in this because of the impact it has just on the way a game plays out when you're so bad at handling pressure like the U.S. was against Japan. This U.S. team cannot play the way Greg Berhalter wants to if they can't deal with pressure, because you can't get your high press going if you can't get the ball over midfield. right? It is all predicated, whether it's possession-based or not. The system, because there are a lot of similarities between what Japan was doing and what the U.S. wants to do. Both systems built on this idea that you get the ball into the opponent's half and then you pin them there with that pressure. And you create your chances off of that. Berhalter wants more, building out of the back and being able to possess the ball. Japan doesn't care as much about that, at least in this game. Regardless of the opponent, the point is the U.S. is never going to get to that. Never going to actually achieve Berhalter's vision if they're that sloppy with the ball. Because they're not going to have the ball in the right positions to actually set up a press that's effective and allows them to control a game. The second lesson. This one more from the Saudi Arabia game, but there is part of the Japan performance that factors into this as well. This is a completely different team without a ball-carrying midfielder. I don't think this can get stressed enough. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but you look at the way the U.S. was playing against Saudi Arabia without Yunus Musah or Luca de la Torre on the field, right? It was trying to get the fullbacks up the field, a bunch of crosses to DeAndre Yedlin playing in that space behind, trying to play balls over the top. There was nothing coming through the midfield. And in general, this team has struggled to create chances without Yunus Musah in the midfield. So part of this is the way that Berhalter tried to attack and this team tried to attack completely changed when neither of his guys who are great with the ball, bringing it forward, were on the field. But also, Luca de la Torre was not particularly good against Japan, and Luca de la Torre is not playing many minutes in La Liga right now. I'm a big fan. He's on the plane if I'm the one making that decision. But it is a bigger concern for me now. What happens if you can't have Yunus Musah out there every single game? I was becoming convinced Luca de la Torre was a more than capable deputy and able to fill that role. Now I'm not so sure, and a lot of that has to do with the fact he's not playing regularly. And when he got thrown into this team, he didn't perform well. So it's not that there's only one way this team can attack, but what makes this midfield so promising for me is that McKennie, Adams, and Musah balance each other out so nicely. Musah complements McKennie. Adams is the one who covers that ground, does the defensive work, wins the ball back, that allows McKennie to be more aggressive. You right, Adams wins the ball back, you give it to Musah. Musah dribbles the ball off the field. It all works. When you put in Kellen Acosta as the third midfielder because Musah is not available, as opposed to putting in Luca de la Torre, all of a sudden the midfield is out of balance, and you have very little creativity in that double pivot. It seems like the double pivot is here to stay, because there was experimentation with Musah in that position, playing him a little bit deeper next to Adams, but then letting him be kind of the connector between the defenders and Adams and McKennie and the attackers. And he's perfect for that because he's so good at carrying the ball forward. You've got to completely rework all of that if he's not there. And if Luca de la Torre can't do that in his place, if that's the decision Berhalter makes if Musah gets suspended or something like that. But it is a major, major concern, and I'm going to get to this more later, but that was one of the things that stuck out to me is there is no replacing Yunus Musah. He is incredibly important to what this team is trying to do in attack. And third, sort of building off of that, this team is going to struggle to break down opponents at the World Cup. We have seen this for too long. They just don't create enough quality chances, particularly away from home. And not having Yunus Musah is definitely part of that. But you still look at the players on the field, and it simply has to be better. Your strikers didn't get much service. We'll get to that in a little bit. And Yeah, there was a chance here or there. Serginho Dest created the one really good chance that actually came from a U.S. player for Jesus Ferreira in that Japan game, and he wasted it. It's going to happen. That's why you need to create more than one a game. There were only, I think it was 2 shots on target across these 180 minutes. Neither of them came against Japan. It's simply not good enough. That attack looks disjointed. The one thing I will say is don't forget Jedi Robinson was tied for the most goal involvements on this team during qualifying. He is an instrumental part of this attack. So when you're looking for reasons to not freak out, because it is 100% valid to be concerned based on these games. These games cannot be dismissed as, oh, they're just friendlies. They're the final games before the World Cup. If those don't matter, then what game outside of an actual tournament does? So you're missing one of your key players in attack. You're missing your ball carrier to bring the ball from the defense to the attack. And you're missing, a Tim Weah. There are pieces missing from this team. It does not excuse how poor they were over these 2 games in attack. But it's not fair to assume because this is what it looked like in these 2 games with this set of players, that's what it's going to look like in Qatar. There are other parts of this that need to be taken into consideration, and the absences are at the top of that list. Now, I'm going to spin that in a negative way at the end here, but this is going to be a challenge to score goals, to create enough chances to make sure you get a goal, unless you have somebody who's really clinical in front of net. And right now, you have to hope that's Christian Pulisic. These strikers, at least the ones in this camp, that's just not what they do. Jesus Ferreira is a good player. He can finish. I like a lot of what he does. He is not a clinical finisher. So if there's one thing Berhalter needs to really try and find a solution for between now and Qatar, it's getting a little bit more rhythm into that attack and figuring out how to break down teams better. And I'm specifically concerned about this in the Wales game because I am convinced Wales is going to mess up somebody's tournament with a 1-0 win where they just sit there, absorb pressure, defend well, you can't break them down, and there goes Gareth Bale, Brennan Johnson, whoever, on the counter. Maybe it's England, maybe it's the US, maybe it's Iran. Somebody. I'm convinced that game is going to happen. And if the US isn't better offensively, it could very well happen in that opener. So those are my 3 big takeaways from these 2 games. Cannot be that bad against high pressure. It's a completely different look when you don't have a ball-carrying midfielder in there. And as a U.S. fan, you need to be prepared for this team to struggle breaking down opponents at the World Cup. Okay, part 2. The positional battles. I'm not going to go through everything, but I want to touch on a couple of them. I am to the point where I don't see how you can justify taking both Josh Sargent and Ricardo Pepi. It's not necessarily their fault, and the service wasn't great. There were a couple opportunities and some hopeful balls played in the first half of the Saudi Arabia game. Pepi wasn't getting on the end of them. Now, some of them got, cut out, and you can also criticize the service. That is perfectly valid. But they weren't also getting involved in the buildup. Pepi barely touched the ball. He had the fewest touches of any player on the U.S. team when he was out there among the starters. Neither of those guys made any kind of impact. Again, the complete attack was a problem. It wasn't just the strikers. But if they're not getting on the end of service and they're not being involved in the buildup, those are the two things Greg Berhalter wants out of his strikers. And I will be in the minority and say I have no issue with the decision Berhalter made in terms of the roster for this camp. If Ricardo Pepi had any chance of making this team, if Berhalter had the slightest interest in bringing him to Qatar, he should have been in this camp, even at the expense of Jordan Pefok. Because like Berhalter said, you know exactly what you're getting with Pefok. Pepe's coming off a year where he, did next to nothing and completely fell out of the national team. Now he is settled at a new club. He's playing better. He's playing regularly. This is your one chance to see him and get him reacclimated and try and get him a little bit of confidence. It didn't work. Again, not entirely Pepe's fault. But just because you bring him to this camp doesn't mean you have to put him on the roster. I'm not willing to take that extra step and say that this roster is Greg Berhalter's preferred one, aside from the obvious guys who will be back, assuming they're healthy. And then my other question is, okay, so Josh Sargent got 45 minutes in this camp, and you're only going to bring 3 strikers because imagine if Berhalter tried to play 4. What was Jordan Pefok going to show you in those 45 minutes that Josh Sargent got that would change anybody's mind about anything? Again, you know exactly what you're going to get. Either you want him included on a team or you don't. Pepi, there was actual value in seeing what he looked like starting against a World Cup opponent, albeit a Saudi Arabia B team missing some key players. But that was much more valuable than Pefok being in this camp. It also reinforced to me Pefok should be on that plane. You need a plan B, something different. I'm not saying you have to start him. But this just reinforced my belief, and I think the belief of plenty of people who follow this team, that bring 2 guys who fit your system. Fantastic. But what does Ricardo Pepi give you or Josh Sargent give you that Jesus Ferreira and the other one of those 2 doesn't? The third one is redundant for me. Pepi didn't do anything to prove he should be on this team, and Jordan Pefok is doing everything he possibly can. At left back, nobody had a particularly good game against Japan, but Sam Vines was rather anonymous, and that was a good thing given how bad that performance was. He got up higher up the field in the second half. He's not at Jedi Robinson. But I am fine with him as a left back too on this roster. To me, Joe Scally, yes, he was good against Saudi Arabia when he came on the right, but when he played on the left, it didn't go very well. I thought Vines looked much more comfortable on that side, which is understandable because, Sam Vines is a left-footed left back and Joe Scally is a right-footed right back. So Serginho Dest is then your third option on the left side if you absolutely need him for some reason. Robinson's going to play every single game, assuming he's available. So that is how I would solve that problem. I would bring Vines, so you have another left footer out there. It gives you the option to bring another center back or another right back because Dest can play over there. So you can bring Yedlin and Cannon, Yedlin, Shaq Moore, Yedlin, Joe Scally, whatever combination, depending on who's healthy, who's in form, whatever Berhalter wants to do. But I will be always uncomfortable if there's only one true left back on this team, because all the other guys are better on the right side of the field. Of course, they can't all play, but the way you maximize this is by starting Dest on the right. And so that means you need to have somebody in case of an emergency on the left, and Sam Vines, to me, proved he can be that guy. The center back position, Aaron Long didn't help himself. Mark McKenzie certainly didn't help himself. Eric Palmer-Brown couldn't help himself. The decisions Berhalter's made in these past couple camps and continuing to go with Long and Zimmerman speaks volumes for me. And by not being there, Chris Richards, Cameron Carter-Vickers were winners. I was curious how this was going to go because those were the guys that called in originally, so you have to believe they're higher on the depth chart. And if anything, that gap is even wider now. The interesting conversation then becomes, is Greg Berhalter concerned enough what he saw from Aaron Long that Chris Richards is now in the conversation to start? It's unfortunate Chris Richards got hurt because maybe he gets one of these starts, and then that conversation gets real interesting if he actually played well in that game. I have a hard time seeing Berhalter changing his mind and not starting Long, but I also feel pretty confident the four center backs, if there's only four of them, are going to be Long, Zimmerman, Richards, and Carter-Vickers, assuming they're all healthy. It's going to be a shaky position. There are concerns, right? Richards isn't playing very much. But Mark McKenzie, every time he's gotten these opportunities in these big games, has just looked overwhelmed. And you saw what he could do with the Union. He's exceptionally talented. But in those big moments for the U.S., he just hasn't been able to kind of deal with everything around him. So I think we got some clarity at the center back position. How much in terms of the gap between center back 1 and center back 2 and center back 3, that I don't think we know. But in terms of the ones Berhalter wants to bring, I think that became pretty clear in this camp. And then finally, Matt Turner should be the starting goalkeeper on this team. It is worth pointing out, right, from the return of this international break to the World Cup, you're playing European competition consistently. And Matt Turner is Arsenal's Europa League goalie. He's not going to get 1-2 games. He's going to get 5, 6, 7. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but he's going to get plenty of playing time. And he is a world-class shot stopper, as I've said before. And he was easily the most impressive player over these 2 games, which is not what you want. But it's the world we find ourselves in, and he was really, really good. I just don't understand how you can justify picking anybody else other than him right now at that goalkeeper position. And then finally, the biggest concerns. Again, 3 of them. Number 1. One of the things that became abundantly clear with the Musa injury is that, and some of this, it's not like this is a revelation that just struck me now, but I didn't appreciate how valuable Musa was to this team until he wasn't there. I knew how good he was. I didn't have a full grasp of just how important he was, though. So there is this core group of players that alarm bells are going to be ringing if they are not available. I'm keeping Pulisic in that group because he just has, right, this raw talent that maybe Gio Reyna can kind of compete with, but he is the best player on this team at a position of really good depth, but you don't want to lose him. And then the 3 guys that to me are the 3 most valuable on this team: Tyler Adams, Yunus Musa, Jedi Robinson. You don't have somebody really capable of replacing Tyler Adams. Kellen Acosta is not exactly the same player. I went on at length about Musa, and I will continue to argue Jedi Robinson is the most valuable player on this team. The gap between this team with those guys healthy and 1 or 2 of those guys missing is striking. And there are enough problems that need to be solved with everybody healthy. Robinson was available for qualifying, still struggled to score goals. Those are the guys to me, and I might even throw Matt Turner on that list too. If you're going to ask me for 5, Matt Turner's my 5th. Those guys are vital. Because you look at some of these other positions, okay, if you lose a striker, regardless of who the striker is, the gap between option 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is minuscule. You lose a center back. It's unfortunate because you've kind of built this pairing and been getting them reps to start. But nobody is super concerned about Chris Richards or Cameron Carter-Vickers. There are enough concerns about Zimmerman and Long. Right back, yeah, it would hurt to lose Serginho Dest. You got plenty of capable backups there. On the wing, as talented as those players are, and as much individual brilliance as they can provide, there are a bunch of them. Of course, the U.S. would have loved to have Tim Weah for this camp. It just would have meant less minutes for Brendan Aronson, Gio Reyna, and Christian Pulisic. It kind of worked in qualifying because one of them seemed to always be unavailable. So you only had 3 guys there, so you started 2 of them and you brought the other one off the bench. There's depth there. You can sort of go, those are the primary positions, but it's not just the players that get hurt, it's the positions they play and what it looks like without them. Because we've kind of gotten a feel for just about everybody at this point. Pulisic missed some qualifying, Reyna missed some qualifying, McKinney, a little bit in and out. Tyler Adams is the guy who's always been there. So we haven't seen that one, but it's just fairly obvious how good he is at what he does. Now we've seen Robinson, now you've seen Musa. And the conversation about what can be expected out of this team changes if those 5 guys, Pulisic, Adams, Musa, Robinson, Turner, or at least 4, aren't available. The conversation about realistic expectations changes because there are going to be injuries. Unfortunate, devastating for the player. It's part of what is going to happen between now and when this final roster is selected. Where those injuries end up being is a massive storyline that needs to be not just the player that's gone, but what that means for the overall squad and how this is supposed to look. That has to be a major talking point and one of the big factors in determining what this team can do in Qatar is where those absences end up being, because unfortunately they're going to happen. Number 2, they are having an incredibly difficult time getting and maintaining control of games. This has been my question for a long time. You can do it against less talented teams in CONCACAF. Can you do it against comparable teams? Not England, not Argentina, whoever you want to, whatever elite team you want to talk about. I'm talking about Wales. I'm talking about Japan. I'm talking about Senegal. Teams that are supposedly on your level, or at least pretty close. Which is why Japan was such a great test. And the U.S. had absolutely no control of that game. And they kind of had control at times against Saudi Arabia, but the second half they didn't have very much control. Control is more than possession, right? It's actually feeling like you are dictating the terms of the game. And it didn't happen very much at all in this camp. And it didn't happen, it hasn't really happened when the U.S. has played better competition. That's one of the next steps. And then finally, this was not particularly specific to this set of games, but set pieces. Obviously, the U.S. did not score one in these 2 games. And it's been, it was a talking point during qualifying. It's been an issue. England will tell you the best way to overcome offensive struggles is set pieces. And the U.S. just doesn't score them, which is strange when you have, players like Reyna and Pulisic to deliver the ball, a fairly decent aerial threat in Walker Zimmerman, an excellent aerial threat in Weston McKennie. It seems like every goal he scores for Juventus almost is a header. It's not like this team inherently is predisposed to be bad at set pieces. And defensively, they've been pretty solid. You don't see a lot of goals. I don't see the U.S. conceding a lot of goals off set pieces. But it's not translating in the attacking part of the field. Delivery isn't always spectacular. And right? There's always the chance that all of a sudden the set piece goals just start coming left and right. But if you are going to struggle this much breaking teams down, the best way to alleviate some of that pressure and give yourself a margin for error, or give yourself a lead when you probably don't deserve it, and then allow you to sit back a little bit, play more on the counter, play in transition, press more effectively. All of that, right? The entire game can change if you just get that one goal out of nothing. And the U.S. has not done that, did not do that during qualifying. So that's my third concern. Again, you got to be able to win multiple ways. You got to be able to generate goals in multiple fashions. Set piece is a big part of that. It's hard to sort of predict or plan for, because it is possible all of a sudden they just start going in. But this is an extended period of time where the U.S. has been really, really poor in that area. And if you get the offensive struggles and the inability to generate goals off set pieces, your margin of error becomes incredibly thin in a group that has 4 teams that feel like they have a shot to get out of the group and get to the knockout stage. There is no guaranteed 3 points in this group. And so you are asking for trouble if you're poor offensively and you're not generating goals off set pieces. So those are my 3 big concerns. There's a group of players that simply have to be healthy, or we have to have a different conversation about what this team's ceiling is. Can they find a way to get and maintain control of games? And can you score some goals off set pieces? Those are my main sort of things to watch, my main areas of concern heading into Qatar.